Hello YouTube, it's me, Logan Albright. Welcome back to my channel, and today I wanted to do something a little bit different. It's come to my attention that April 15th is the birthday of a writer and thinker who I greatly admire, one of my personal heroes, and someone who is not well known. So I kind of wanted to take this opportunity to bring him to your attention and talk about some of his books. He's a nonfiction writer, so it's not my usual kind of novel critique that I do on this channel, but it's someone that if you like kind of interesting and different and controversial books, you may get pleasure in this. So the man I'm talking about is a Hungarian psychiatrist named Thomas Szasz, born in Budapest in 1920, died in America in 2012, so just 10 years ago. I only learned about him after he died, unfortunately, but he had a very long career. He lived to be 92 years old, and he was continued writing well up into his 80s. Very brilliant thinker, spoke perfect English, and a huge critic of the way that psychiatry is practiced in America and the way that mental patients are treated. So this is my collection of his books. It's a bit of a handful. I have 16 of his books. He's written, I don't know how many, but many more than I have, and I pick them up whenever I am in a used bookstore and happen to see them. But I thought I would go through a few of them and talk about why I think he's so special and why I think he's an important thinker who deserves to be remembered, even 10 years after his death. And this is going to be a little bit of a controversial video because his views are largely unpopular, and a lot of people take very steep offense to what he has to say, but I'm going to try to explain it the best I can in a way that maybe people won't get too mad at me for talking about. So here we go. So Thomas Szasz was a psychiatrist who had grave concerns about the way that his profession was practiced and what he saw as the violation of rights of individuals and mistreating people in the name of medicine, and he had a real problem with that. And so most of his writings are focused on the way that mental patients are treated and how they ought to be treated differently and how we ought to have more respect for consent and personal autonomy and things of that nature. He was actually instrumental in getting a lot of involuntary commitment laws overturned in the 1970s and 80s and really helped a lot of people out. And as someone who cares deeply about human freedom and individualism and personal responsibility, someone like this is really important to me and my own way of thinking. And so I really am compassionate for people who are going through mental problems and having challenges in their lives, and the last thing I want to see is for them to be mistreated or treated against their will. So the first book and the most famous book by Thomas Szasz that I want to talk about is one of his early works, but certainly his most controversial and his most talked about. It's called The Myth of Mental Illness. Now, before everyone gets mad at me, let me explain what he means by this, because people tend to think, they read the title, and understandably, they think that he is trying to delegitimize their suffering or say that they are liars or just making it up when they say that they're suffering from mental problems. But Szasz is taking a very medical approach to this, and he's taking a very literal approach to this. And his argument in this book, The Myth of Mental Illness, is that the concept of mental illness is a real thing. It's a problem that exists. It's people suffer in a variety of ways. People have difficulties in living in a variety of ways, but the term illness is inappropriate as a way to describe it because it's a metaphor that leads to all sorts of bad consequences. It's not literally an illness because the mind is not an organ of the body. We have an organ of the body called the brain, and the people who work on that are called neurologists or neurosurgeons, but psychiatrists work on the mind, which isn't an actual physical thing, so it can't actually be ill. And what Szasz is arguing is that by couching the supposed treatment of psychiatric conditions as medicine, as treating illnesses, you're opening the door to kind of legitimizing a lot of very bad behavior. You're allowing people to be abused, to be imprisoned without their consent. They have these voluntary commitment laws where people are put away allegedly for their own good or for reasons of treatment. Throughout history, there have been all kinds of barbaric treatments like electroshock therapy, insulin shock therapy, lobotomies where pieces of the brain are removed. And these are all done in the name of medicine. They're all done in the name of helping or curing someone. Often someone who didn't have any desire to be a patient, often someone who didn't have any desire for treatment, often someone who didn't consent to these treatments. And so what Szasz is arguing in The Myth of Mental Illness is that the metaphor of mental illness is used as a way to legitimize behaviors that would otherwise be unacceptable in society and to marginalize people who really should be helped. And so that's kind of his main claim in that book. And it's his most famous, but I don't think it's his best book. I like it. It's the first book I read by him. It's what turned me on to his writing, but it's really not my favorite of his. My favorite of his is this one, a much later book called Insanity, an Idea and Its Consequences. And this is kind of grappling with the topic of insanity as not a medical diagnosis, but rather a political condition. that whether or not someone is insane is not a matter of medicine, it's a matter of law, because what insanity means in the United States has a very specific legal definition, and it has to do with what people are allowed to consent to. It has to do with how people are treated in the judicial system. And Szasz kind of repeats a lot of his arguments from the myth of mental illness in here, but I think he goes into more depth, and I think he explains his points a lot better about how the concept of insanity is used to kind of separate society into two classes from a governmental perspective, and say that we have these people who behave a certain way that we approve of, and those are responsible adults and they can be left to their own devices. These people behave a way that we don't approve of, and so we're going to call them insane, and it's just up to someone, usually a judge, someone with no medical qualifications, to decide whether or not we call them insane, and those people will be treated differently and they'll have their rights taken from them. And so that's his objection there. And so that's what he outlines in the book Insanity, which is my personal favorite of all his books that I've read. I've read many of them, but I think it's a great argument, and it's really tries to draw attention to the fact that we're creating this kind of underclass of people who we don't take seriously, who we don't pay attention to their wants and their desires, we don't pay attention to their consent, and we treat them as something less than human. And I think that's a really terrible thing. The next book of his I want to talk about is called The Manufacture of Madness. And I think this is a really fascinating book. This draws a parallel between the Inquisition, basically, the searching out of heretics and witches and magic users and things like that, and persecuting them, and the mental health movement, where people are labeled as mad or insane or irresponsible, and things are done to them without their consent. It's kind of a comparative analysis between those two things. And I think it's a fascinating idea, and it's something I kind of drew heavily on in my book over here, which I have to plug, as always, Conform or Be Cast Out, The Literal Demonization of Nonconformists. If you're interested in the types of things Szasz is writing about marginalizing people based on their behavior, this might be a book that you would enjoy. Anyway, enough of that. But one of the ideas I found most compelling in The Manufacture of Madness is this idea that you are guilty until proven innocent, and that there's actually no way to demonstrate your innocence once you've been accused of something. Just like if you've been accused of being a witch during the Inquisition, anything you then say or do is taken as evidence of your guilt. There's no way out of it. And the same thing is true with mental illness. Anything that you do, once you've been labeled as crazy, anything that you do is then taken as further evidence of your craziness, and there's no way to get out of it. And this is illustrated particularly potently in a couple of cases where journalists got themselves deliberately committed to mental institutions to kind of see what goes on there. And as soon as they got admitted, they told the people in charge, we're not really crazy, we're journalists, we're doing this for an article. And it was very difficult for them to get out because nobody would believe them. They say, yeah, that's what you would say if you were crazy. Of course you're going to claim that. And the doctors in charge couldn't obviously tell the difference between the journalist who was there pretending to be crazy and someone who was actually crazy, or someone who they claimed was actually crazy, depending on how much weight you put on those terms. So like there's no actual legitimate medical way to tell the difference between a sane or an insane person. I have to use the scare quotes there because these journalists were unable to get out of the institutions without massive help from the outside. So that's a really interesting parallel, and one of his more interesting books, I think, The Manufacture of Madness. In addition to his advocacy for mental patients, Thomas Szasz was a fierce defender of individual rights in sort of taboo subjects. He wrote a number of books on drug legalization. He thought it was wrong for the state to deprive people of medicines that could help them or that they wanted or felt they needed to be healthy and to be happy. So I actually don't have any of his books on that subject, but I do have this book called Fatal Freedom, which I think is wonderful. And this was one of his last books he wrote, and it's about the ethics of suicide prohibition. And basically he's arguing, just as he's arguing in the drug legalization case, that people who wish to have some control over the end of their lives, that wish to take charge over that moment, shouldn't be prevented from doing so by the state, that it's not the state's role to decide when and how people die. People should have some agency in when and how they die, and that to stop them is inhumane. And he also takes a very curious position here, because it's one that I agree with, but it's one that nobody takes, which is that he's anti-euthanasia, but he's pro-suicide legalization. And the reason he gives is that he thinks that it's wrong to kill other people. And so for a doctor to engage in killing is sort of the opposite of what doctors are supposed to do. To have a doctor who engages in euthanasia is going against the Hippocratic Oath, and it's doing something that doctors really shouldn't be in the position of doing. In addition, there's all kinds of moral hazard and incentive problems with that. Whereas someone ending their own life, it's purely their decision. They're only acting on their own body. They're not affecting anybody else. So it should be up to them to make that decision. And, we make decisions that lengthen or shorten our lives or impact the probable circumstances of our death all the time, every day. Every time we get in the car, every time we eat, drink alcohol, every time we eat a hamburger, we're making a decision that impacts our long-term chances of survival or the ways in which we might die. So he argues in this book that, allowing people more control over the way that they exit the world is humane and just. And so I found this a fascinating read. Again, very controversial. People get really very, very angry when you say this sort of thing. They say that, people who want to kill themselves are by definition insane and therefore should be prevented. To me, that shows a lack of respect for consent and personal autonomy. So I'm not really into that. But, to each his own. And then the last book that I was going to bring up is this collection of essays, which I really like, called Medicalization of Everyday Life. And this is sort of a play on a Freud work, which is called The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. And Szasz was a very vehement critic of Freud, really disliked a lot of the theories of Freud. But here in this book, he's arguing that we have entered a type of society where we wish to make everything into a pathology, and we want to medicalize everything. Any behavior that people engage in that we find a little bit weird or hard to understand or inconvenient, we wish to then label that as some kind of pathology, and we wish to try to cure it with medicalization, with drugs. And he says that's a bad thing. We should respect the variety of human behavior and respect the variety of human life, and not force our views of what people should be and how they should behave on other people. He's got a lot of rants against family members who are saying, oh, our crazy uncle is sort of becoming inconvenient. Let's shunt him off into a mental institution and have someone else deal with him. Let's drug him up to the gills so that he can't really cause us problems anymore. It's a lack of respect for human dignity, basically. And so this is a collection of essays that deal with a wide variety of topics, but that's sort of the overall theme, is this tendency that we have as a society to label everything as a disorder, to label everything as a pathology, and to then try to correct all those things with drugs and medication, which is interesting because, like I said, he's in favor of allowing people the drugs that they want, but he's not in favor of giving people drugs that they don't want against their will, involuntarily violating their consent. So, a very controversial figure. A lot of people really, really hate him. A lot of people get really, really angry when I bring up these kind of topics because they feel like they're being delegitimized, and what they believe about themselves and what they've been told about themselves or their loved ones is being delegitimized. I really think that's the wrong way to look at his point. I really don't think that's the case. He has tremendous compassion for people who are suffering and people who are going through difficulties in living, whether it's depression or anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorders or any of these things that we now treat with drugs and all kinds of other psychiatric treatments. He wanted to help these people, but he just believed that the way we're going about it is not helpful to them, and that it actually makes things worse by dehumanizing them, claiming that they have no agency or control over their own lives, and putting them in the hands of people who want to control them and want to use the state and the law to impose involuntary treatments on them, whether they want them or not. So I think he's an incredible defender of human rights, an incredible defender of human liberty, someone who helped a lot of people by getting the deinstitutionalization going in the 70s and 80s, by getting people released from mental institutions, by overturning the laws that allowed people to be detained in mental institutions without their consent. I mean, there's still some remnant of those left, but it's much less bad than it used to be. Just a hero in my view. Had an incredible career, very long life, and not well known today. He's kind of been pushed off to the sidelines of academia. People don't like to acknowledge that he existed because his theories fly in the face of so much of medical orthodoxy and psychiatric orthodoxy these days. But I wanted to call attention to him because he's one of my favorite thinkers, and I hope that you will, get something out of this and check out his books and maybe be interested in them. And if not, that's okay too. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with him, but maybe I just hope you'll listen with an open mind and hear that, having a different point of view is sometimes valuable, and sometimes it's nice to challenge orthodox opinions about things, even if you don't end up agreeing with the challenge. It's nice to, these things need to be tested continually. This is how the scientific process works, Things have to be continually tested and argued against to see if they withstand the criticism. And if they withstand the criticism, fine. But I think we shouldn't be afraid to make those arguments. So that's pretty much all I have to say today. Happy birthday to Thomas Szasz. Although he's no longer with us, he remains a very influential figure in my life and someone who I have great respect for. So I hope that you got something out of this. And I will catch you next time with another more conventional novel review. I apologize if this has diverted you too much from my usual content. But I like to do things different every once in a while. I've been your host, Logan Albright. Thanks so much for watching. If you got something out of this, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, leave me a comment down below and let me know what you thought, and I'll catch you next time.